Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, also known as Chapeau Langue by Priest, and guess what? We are in the final stretch, and at first, I was going to try to break this up into two separate videos, but I have decided we are going to read the remaining 60 pages of this freaking book, including the author afterward. So, I hope you guys are ready for a little bit of a longer video. I'm not really sure how much longer. Also, I'm not really sure where that English accent came from. Anyways, I hope you all enjoy. Yeah, let's get to it. Mid-Autumn Festival. Although Master Feng Han had spent most of his lifetime with engines and dogs as his sole companions, he also made it unscathed through the reigns of two unreliable emperors. The hot blood of passion coursing through his chest had been ground down and stifled, but never spilled in the end. When his nation nearly fell into enemy hands, he pressed his ill-tempered and stubborn old bones into service, holding up the spirit of Ling Shu. Unfortunately, Guyuan set aside his Black Hawk armor as he spat out a mouthful of sand with no change in expression. He has no worthy successor. This Gepang Xiao's as unreliable as Cao Niangzi and Master Feng Han put together. Kid, are you okay? Do you need me to carry you? The little Lingshu scholar beside him nearly cried from fright at the offer, terrified to trouble the Marquis of Order so. Limping along, he shook his head as fast as a spinning fire pinion. Before them stretched the boundless, unpopulated grasslands beyond the border pass, and behind them was a pile of scrap charred beyond recognition. The Marquis of Order shielded his eyes and squinted toward the sun, then flapped his hand in exasperation. I know this place. Follow me. I must have been bored or stupid to join you brats in your games instead of eating and drinking well in the capital. As for how he'd come to join them, it was a long story. As the Mid-Autumn Festival approached, Marshal Gu, presently on an inspection patrol of the borders, was delayed a few days by some minor affairs. By the time he was ready to depart, it was only 2 days before the holiday. The steam railway was still under construction in this part of the West. If he wanted to make it back in time to celebrate with Chang'an, it would be on the wings of Black Hawk armor. Of course, Chang'an would never allow Guyuan to tire himself like that. The emperor had planned for this exact scenario and found an excuse to be away from the capital on an inspection tour, sending a messenger to tell Guyuan not to hurry back. The nation had been at peace for years, and with Guyuan keeping watch over the four borders, there were no wars to fight. The Lingshu Institute had been freed to pour all their passion into a series of pet projects. They had created a cross between the Black Hawks and giant kites, a yet unnamed prototype that they'd been testing in the sparsely populated northwestern border regions. It had a similar look to the wooden birds the Linyuan pavilion used to deliver messages, round and sturdy, with a belly large enough to carry more than 20 black carapaces. Upon hearing that the Lingshu Institute was digging around out in the northwest, the idle Marshal Gu grew too curious to sit still and took a trip out to observe. Guchun was gesturing dramatically as he showed off his latest contraption to the Marquis of Anding. Now, those giant kites, they could be late to their own funeral. A single trip beyond the pass takes half a year. They're slow and they guzzle violet gold. What use do they have beyond intimidating some foreigners? Hawks are very fast, but they're not a one-man job and have limited carrying capacity. Not just anyone can fly them. And long journeys are hard on their pilots. This new ship has both speed and carrying capacity. We could even adapt it for civilian use in the future. It'd be just the thing for carrying rich idiots like old Du. Marquis, you've come at the right time. We've just concluded a successful test flight. Would you like to take it for a spin? Guyuan was used to flying Black Hawk armor Hitcher and Yan and figured it was just a flight. He wouldn't be getting scammed or wasting his money, so he happily accepted the invitation. Yet somehow, he'd managed to joyride himself right into trouble on a holiday of all days. Black Hawk armor required its operator to maintain their own equilibrium. But this big-bellied wooden bird was controlled by a pilot. In this instance, the pilot in question was a little Lingshu scholar who couldn't have been more than 19 and scarcely dared to breathe in Guyuan's presence. He looked the opposite of reliable. Peering at the boy's little round face, Marshal Gu felt suddenly hesitant, but he barely settled in his seat when a wooden bird shot into the sky like a Parhelion arrow. The thing had a bulging belly, but it wasn't much slower than a black hawk, launching into the sky with a screech like the cry of a wild bird as it winged into the unpopulated wilderness. It was unlike the giant kites, which sailed with a gentle swaying motion, and also unlike Black Hawk armor, which flew at such speeds the cold wind scraped across one's face even with the visor down. It was a joyful experience of its own kind, and Guyun was sold as soon as they finished their first lap. He urged the little Lingshu scholar to fly them higher and farther. What they didn't expect was to encounter a real bird passing by as they sailed through the clouds. At the sight of this technological monstrosity, the poor thing thought it had caught sight of an ancestor that had cultivated into a great spirit in broad daylight. Stunned, the hapless creature forgot to flap its wings and crashed right into them. In order to reduce the weight of the vessel, the wooden bird wasn't nearly as sturdy as Black Hawk's. The velocity of their collision sent the little sparrow crashing through the fire pinions on both wings, and the gold tank promptly exploded in a shower of fireworks. Guyun was nearly thrown from the ship's belly. The ship, which moments ago had seemed as if it could fly straight up into heaven, began to plummet, plunging northward and trailing a thick plume of dark smoke. Thankfully, a set of Black Hawk armor had been stowed in the tail of the wooden bird. At the last second, Guyun grabbed the Lingshu scholar, tore open the bird's belly, and leapt from the craft before it cratered into the ground. But his ill luck didn't end there. This hawk armor was old and in despair. It couldn't bear the weight of 2 people. With an enormous effort, Guyun managed to steady it and glide several hundred meters, skimming the ground before a thunderous boom sounded behind them. The trim wooden bird had become a scorched sparrow. Poor, unfortunate Guchun waited for hours before coming to terms with the fact that the Marquis of Order had indeed flown off into the sunset on a little bird, never to return. Scared to tears, he ordered someone to write an urgent memorial to Chang, then tore it off into the north on horseback to look for the lost Marquis of Anding. Giant kites are slow, but they don't drop out of the sky. Guyun removed a wing panel from the hawk armor with deft fingers and handed it to the little Lingshu scholar to use as a walking stick. Come here, I'll help you. Hey, I don't bite. You don't need to be so scared. The little scholar wasn't yet 20. He had still been a child when Guyun defended the capital with his life and recovered the nation's 4 borders. He had grown up listening to tales of the Marquis of Order's legendary deeds and never imagined he would one day meet the man in the flesh, much less nearly be smashed to bits with him. He was agitated beyond measure and tentatively allowed Guyun to help him walk, afraid to take a single breath as his leg went weak with lack of oxygen. Hey! Seeing the little scholar wilt to the side, Guyun grabbed him by the back of the collar. I say, is the Lingshu Institute restricting your rations? Why are you so weak at your age? They had glided some distance after the wooden bird took damage and crash-landed in an inconvenient location. Their flight had very likely taken them past the borders of Great Liang, and now that their wooden bird had gone up in flames, it was best they left as soon as possible to avoid unnecessary trouble. But there was a limit to how fast Guyun could move, dragging dead weight like this Lingshu scholar behind him. The 2 of them spent a whole day plodding through unpopulated grass plains. The little scholar knew he was a burden. He felt unbearably awkward about it and wished increasingly that he could dig a hole and bury himself alive. As the sun began to sink in the west, he was near to tears. Marquis Gu, what if you left me and went on ahead? You can send someone to pick me up later. Oh dear, don't start crying on me now. Guyun had joined the army at 15. He'd never met such a crybaby. At a loss, he pointed in a random direction and said, Look, There's something over there. Although Guyuan had been cured of the barbarian poison, it was impossible to reverse the accumulated damage of years. His eyesight was still poor in the dark, and he proceeded after sundown by intuition alone. He hadn't seen a thing and was merely trying to comfort the kid. But when the little scholar heard, he wiped his eyes and cried out, "My lord, I see lights." Guyuan was speechless. As the two of them walked on, the scenery grew more and more familiar. Signs of life appeared around them, and when Guyuan saw the underground river flowing toward the little town from the north, he halted in his tracks. They had arrived in Yanhui town. The little town of Yanhui had transformed in the years since Guyuan had last seen it. The original town was now part of the trade region along the border, and many of the old residents had moved 8 kilometers south. The shores of the underground river bustled with merchants from the north and south. This was no longer the impoverished middle-of-nowhere town he had known. Without a thought as to whether someone might recognize him on the street, Guyuan found a tiny medical clinic, dropped off the young scholar with his injured leg, and went out to wander the streets. On the shores of the underground river, he spotted a peddler selling sweet osmanthus cakes. Recalling how Chang had loved them when he traveled through Jiangnan in his youth, he strolled over and bought a few. Next, curiosity piqued by the crowds flocking in the direction of General's Slope. He remembered the locals used to think it haunted. He followed the throng, eager to see what was going on. At some point, a little shrine had been erected on the once abandoned mound. Travelers coming to offer incense flowed in and out in an unending stream. Guyuan found a peddler selling incense sticks and candles. Whose shrine is this? What deity are they worshipping? They're worshipping a mountain deity. The peddler gestured enthusiastically. Sir, is this your first time here? Then you won't have heard the story. This hill is General Slope, the most famous landmark in our Yanhui town. When the 3 divisions of the Black Iron Battalion returned victorious from battle, they abandoned their broken armor here, piling it into a mound. Marshal Gu himself captured Jiala Yinghua alive right here in Yanhui town, and it's also here that he recovered the 4th prince, our current emperor. It's said His Majesty often trained with his sword here on General Slope in his youth. Just think, this slope is protected by the 3 divisions of the Black Iron Battalion and carries the vital energy of the Imperial Dragon. With such a connection to His Majesty, aren't prayers offered here guaranteed to be heard? Feeling rather honored by association, Guyuan nodded. Right, of course they'd be heard. Making the most of Guyuan's attention, the peddler continued. Buy some incense and offer a prayer, sir. Your wishes are sure to come true. You know, I think I'll do just that. Amused, Guyuan rummaged for his spare change, planning to offer up a few prayers to the vital energy of the Imperial Dragon his Chang'e had left behind. As he groped around in his pouch, he asked, "What are they praying for? High placement in the Imperial examinations? Since it's called General's Slope, it's probably better for the martial examinations than the civil ones, no?" The peddler flapped a dismissive hand. "That's the domain of the Buddhas. Our mountain deity doesn't do that." "What does the mountain deity do?" "Promotions and riches, good fortune in marriage, and you can even ask for children." Grinning broadly, the peddler said, "Sir, how many wives and concubines do you have? How many children? Do you have both sons and daughters? If you're satisfied, pray on behalf of a friend. It's an easy favor and guaranteed to work." Guyuan turned to go. "Hey, sir, wait just a minute. If you don't want to pray for children, asking for riches also works. You're sure to have excellent fortune in the coming year, basins overflowing with cash. You can even ask to be blessed with a good marriage. You're elegant and handsome. With those peach blossom eyes, you're sure to be afflicted with trials in love your entire life." Guyuan cursed him out with a laugh. "Oh, fuck off with that." He didn't know whether he should laugh or cry. Once, while chatting with Shen Jinping on the front of Liangjiang, he'd boasted he was willing to protect home and country and become the most famous general of his generation. In 100 years, he declared, he'd ascend to godhood on the worship of the common people, and he could live off their offerings, plying the trades of swindler, matchmaker, and Guanyin Bodhisattva. He'd never imagined that before 100 years had passed, the little hill where Chang'e had once trained so diligently with his sword would beat him to the honor. After leaving General Slope, Guyuan released a wooden bird to alert Ge Pangxiao and his subordinates to his location, then found an inn to stay the night. Seeing the moon round as a silver dish overhead, he realized it was already the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival. Everyone had gone home to be with their family. No wonder the inn was so quiet. It had been nearly 20 years since he'd picked up a young Chang'e on the verge of death outside the walls of Yanhui. Like a flowing river, time had slipped past before he knew it. Moved by this thought, Guyuan leapt up to the roof and pulled out the white jade flute he always kept with him, then lifted it to his mouth and began to play. For once, he managed to hold a tune. The melody was one Chang'e had written for him years ago in a sudden stroke of inspiration. Marshal Gu spent some 3 years learning this one tune, nearly tormenting Chang'e to the point of ascension in the meantime. Before the end, His Majesty had begun contemplating chopping off his own dragon's claw, that hand that had made such trouble for himself, and the mere sight of the white jade flute had given him a migraine. A long cry rang out overhead. Startled, Guyuan looked up to see several Black Hawks wheeling toward the ground. These brats sure showed up Before he could say quick, the Black Hawk in the lead streaked toward him with a wild gust that left Guyuan squinting into the wind. A hand grabbed him by the collar, the power of violet gold lifting his feet off the ground. Rows of storm lanterns around the inn puffed out in the gale stirred by the hawk's wings. Guyuan still hadn't gotten a good look at the person who had the audacity to manhandle him like this when he heard a ferocious growl at his ear. Gusashi! He whipped his head back and caught sight of his dear emperor, whom he had last heard was out on an inspection tour. Aren't you? The group of Black Hawks shadowing Chang'e touched down in quick succession, all of them dropping to one knee in a flurry of wings. Chang'e would never let Guyuan tire himself, but thought nothing of putting himself to the same trouble. He'd embarked on a long-distance flight by Black Hawk to surprise Guyuan, but hadn't even reached the Northwest Garrison when Guchan's message intercepted him and scared him out of his wits. His hands were shaking even now. After his initial snarl, he couldn't seem to get another word out. Taking in his travel-worn state, Guyuan guessed the gist of what had happened. Oh shit, he thought. He had angered the mountain deity with his ridicule, and the deity had sent swift retribution in the form of this man who was both his great love and great trial. Guyuan dismissed the Black Hawks with a wave and stepped forward to grab Chang'e's elbow, leading him inside as he glibly continued where he'd left off. Aren't you the goddess of the Moon Palace? Why have you snuck down here? Chang'e shook his arm but failed to dislodge Guyuan. He laughed in anger. Don't you try that with me. Let go. With a clever shift of his weight, Guyuan tugged Chang'e toward him. I won't. Since you've fallen into my arms on this world of mortal dust, you can forget about returning to the ranks of heaven. Chang'e glared at him, but when he looked into that face he hadn't seen in 3 months, half of his scowl evaporated on its own. I was thinking, if they really perfected that wooden bird, I'd be able to make it back in time to see you for the Mid-Autumn Festival next year. Guyuan threw everything he had into it, gazing imploringly into Chang'e's eyes. Don't blame Xiao Ge, okay? Chang'e never could maintain any anger or firmness with Guyuan. At his concession, the fury on his face reduced by half again, and he seemed to struggle to remain stoic. Besides, I brought a set of hawk armor along with me, didn't I? I was never in any danger. How could I stand to make you worry? Guyuan's eyes curved in a smile as he played his trump card. He slid that oil paper packet from his lapels, the fragrance of osmanthus flowers spilling out even through the wrapping. Look what I have. Chang'e was silent. Guyuan grabbed his hand and pressed his advantage. If not for this, you wouldn't have had the chance to come back to Yanhui Town and take a look around. Do you still remember this place? A complicated look crossed his face as Chang'un carefully tucked the osmanthus cakes into his lapels. He said, peeved, I do. I also remember how, despite being blind and deaf, you insisted on shoving yourself into the crowds at the market and nearly fell into the underground river. Struck by a sudden realization, he turned to glare at Guyuan. 20 years ago, I was always worried sick about you. How come it's just the same 20 years later? I haven't made any progress at all. Guyuan burst out laughing and dragged him outside. As long as I've made progress, it's okay. Come on, I'll take you on a tour of the new Yanhui town. There'll be no riffraff trying to get in on the fun today. Just the two of us. Improving at flattery counts as progress. You... Marquis! Chang'un was still speaking when a mournful wail rose up over the wind. Guchun had found them. Guyuan grabbed Chang'un's arm and darted out the inn's back door. Speak of the devil, the riffraff have arrived. Let's get out of here. Torn between laughter and tears, Chang'un allowed himself to be dragged through a maze of back alleys. After a series of twists and turns to lose the hapless Guchun, Guyuan threw Chang'un a mischievous smile. I'll take you on a tour through the town. We can walk north along the underground river. General Slope is the liveliest, and the underground river is open tonight. There are plenty of pleasure boats about. We could sail back to the inn afterward. Chang'un looked at him with a half smile. We could sail there, too. Wait. What? Perplexed, Guyuan heard the familiar notes of a guqin behind him. He whirled around to see a massive pleasure boat drifting down the middle of the underground river, carrying Shun Yi and his darling son upon his shoulders, nodding in time with Miss Chun's guqin. He met Guyuan's eyes and saluted across the distance, showing all his teeth in a grin that was bright as day from the nighttime river ablaze with lanterns. Sir! Several Blackhawks landed on Shun Yi's boat, Old He in the lead with his voice like a gong. He raised the wooden bird Guyuan had sent out in one hand, guffawing so hard his mouth looked apt to split at the corners. I heard you fell out of the sky dicking around on a bird. Shooting a glance at Guyuan, Chang'un couldn't resist smiling at the rare sight of this man speechless with fury. Water roared in the underground river, and the dark silhouettes of trees rustled under silver moonlight. As he looked around, he discovered this small town where he'd grown up was almost unrecognizable. Their barbarian enemies had ceased their incursions, and their faraway expeditions were over. The stiff autumn wind shouldn't scatter the clear light of the moon. Loved ones gathered round beneath the full moon, and the world was utterly new. First meeting. Shun Yi reined his horse to a halt and vaulted off, sprinting over to Guyuan and panted out, Zishi! Zishi! Raising a field scope, Guyuan hummed but didn't turn, eyes never leaving the patrol of barbarian scouts making their silent departure. A dozen birds, big wagons stuffed full of violet gold, leaving tracks of palms width deep. Right then, as expected of the commander of the 8 northern commanderies, he has an impressive appetite and such dauntless courage. It was the 23rd year of Yuan He. Guyuan had recently received a secret edict to visit the northern border in search of the lost 4th prince, who had disappeared among the commoners. The 4th prince's birth mother was a northern barbarian woman, of the same origin as that poison that so grievously injured Guyuan's eyes and ears in childhood. Not a single member of the Black Iron Battalion would have dared poke his sore spot like this, but his elderliness the Emperor had no such qualms. The Yuan He Emperor's intentions were plain. The youngest prince had been lost for many years, and if he should be found, the sudden change in his circumstances would surely leave the child anxious and terrified. Asking Guyuan to escort him was the Emperor's way of encouraging Guyuan to form a good relationship with this boy and bury past grudges. If the old Emperor wanted to shove him face first into such a role, Guyuan couldn't outright disobey. So he simply dawdled, sending people to perform a cursory search every now and again. If he hadn't discovered the barbarian's suspicious movements, he would still be sitting pretty in his original post, keeping watch over the western regions. The search for the unknown little princeling could never have galvanized him to set out himself. Jiping, you've come at just the right time. Guyuan, who had yet to reach the age of 20, let a mischievous smirk tug at the corner of his lips. He tossed the field scope to Shenyi. Head back tomorrow and transfer a troop of Blackhawks here. Sweat dripped from Shenyi's brow. Never mind that. The little prince. Guyuan was at the peak of his youthful arrogance, and a cluster of military leaders on the northern border who repeatedly resisted his orders had just allowed evidence of their wrongdoings to fall right into his hands. All his thoughts were on how to drag those imbeciles off their high horses, and he continued without really listening. We needn't hurry to catch our two-faced commandant. Let's watch a little longer. Let the barbarians bleed a bit more. I want to see how many vermin they'll flush out with their plot to corrode our gold. We can reel them all in at once and confiscate all the violet gold they've smuggled in from the north. Shenyi jogged after him. But the little prince. Oh, we'll just say we haven't found him yet, said Guyuan, ready to lie through his teeth. Let his golden branches and jade leaves grow wild a little longer. He's so big already. What's another year or two? There's no rush. Without him, what excuse would I have to run off to the north so often? These tongue waggers in the Imperial Censorate are going on and on about the secret edict as it is. At the end of his patience, Shenyi resorted to insubordination and grabbed Guyuan by the shoulder. What are you doing? Guyuan asked. The little prince is missing, Shenyi cried. Guyuan raised an eyebrow in exasperation. Missing? Then send someone to find him. What are you still dithering about here for? The Blackhawks are reporting the kid ran out beyond the pass on his own. Guyuan clicked his tongue in frustration and looked back toward the horizon. Clouds gathered there, dark and oppressive, presaging another blizzard on the harsh northern border. He frowned. What a pain in the neck. Heaven forbid he gets eaten by wolves. Shenyi was appropriately terrified of his prophetic crow's beak. My dear comrade, can't you be a little more optimistic? Come on then, let's go take a look. The snow came thick and fast. Within the blink of an eye, the land and sky were a blanket of white. The thickest fox fur coats couldn't fend off the teeth of the bitter northern wind. Guyuan blinked off the snow sticking to his eyelashes and took a sip of liquor for warmth, grumbling to himself. This little whelp, is he trying to get himself killed? Sir! A black hawk, braving the snowstorm, had landed before them. There's a pack of those barbarian-reared wolves 2 kilometers northwest. I approached under cover of the storm, but I couldn't get too close without alerting them. Wolves? Shenyi turned to Guyuan in surprise. Only barbarian nobles are allowed to raise wolves. The nobles stay as far from our borders as they can. Why would one of them bring a wolf pack here? Huh. You know, I did hear a rumor, Guyuan began, thoughtful. The barbarian crown prince, the one called Jiala Yinghua, they say he had some sort of affair with their goddess. Who knows if it's true? The 4th prince is the son of the goddess and his majesty, Shenyi blenched. If Jiala Yinghua knew the little highness left Huga our sight, do you think he would... Ayo. Gleefully speculating about the drama, Guyuan sighed. He must be green as a jade tsunami with envy. Sir, Shenyi yelled, have a whit of decency. The wolves' masters can't be far. Blackhawks, you stay here. We don't want them to know we're here just yet. Jiping, you and I will go. Guyuan dug his heels into his horse's side and streaked off into the distance. The storm raged around them, wind and snow buffeting their faces and choking their mouths and noses until their throats ached. Guyuan and Shenyi urged their horses on and soon heard the mournful howls of wolves on the wind. Shenyi shuddered. That child, he's only 11 or 12. If the wolves find him first, would the boy survive? But he was a prince of the nation. He cast a glance at Guyuan, wrapped in a snow-white fox fur coat and a white cloak. Even his horse was white. The slightest slip in focus, and his commander, with his swift, steady steed, would melt right into the snowstorm. Shun Yi suddenly thought of how, 11 years ago, the attack on the Black Iron Battalion had sent the tender little playboy sprout in the Marquis estate tumbling from his comfortable nest of brocade overnight. How could he possibly bear no grudge against the barbarian woman's child, prince or no? Perhaps he was only going through the motions of complying with imperial orders. Perhaps Gu Yuan didn't care at all whether the little prince was alive or dead. If the unlucky child had already perished under the jaws of those wolves, Gu Yuan would simply need to come up with some excuse to present to the emperor. The emperor was old, and Great Liang's younger generation of hawks and wolves were eager to bear their black iron forged claws and fangs. They planned to unleash a bloody storm in the northwest, even if the imperial blood flowed in his veins. How long could a meager youth with no backing from his maternal family and no friends or relatives depend on the distant, dubitable traces of fatherly affection? A shrill howl cut through the air. Shun Yi came back to himself with a shudder. "Jiping!" Gu Yuan called. On the low rise before them, several large wolves with glossy, well-fed coats had appeared. The pack took a few slow steps toward their uninvited guests, the only warning they got before the beasts were lunging toward the men on their horses. Although Gu Yuan and Shun Yi both wore civilian clothing, their steeds were battle-trained, unafraid of the snarling wolves. They reared up with a long whinny and charged. Shun Yi couldn't show his wind slasher with barbarians so close. Instead, he grabbed a spare pair of iron stirrups and crashed them together. The screech of metal on metal echoed through the empty snowfields, and the wolves arched their backs in fright. Shun Yi lowered his voice. "Sushi, do we kill them?" "What do you mean, do we kill them?" Gu Yuan hissed out the corner of his mouth. "We're a pair of frail scholars passing by." Raising his voice again, he yelled, "Dagu, don't be afraid. Get out that medicinal powder that repels beasts. You hang on here. I'll run for help." Shun Yi was lost for words. Gu Zishi! How did this jackass pull off such a realistic performer of a pretty boy fleeing in the face of danger? It was like he had rehearsed it 1,000 times. The howling blizzard winds beyond the pass came from every direction. At present, they were upwind of the wolves, an opportunity he couldn't miss. He set aside his spat with a certain goo bastard and tossed the packet of medicine into the air, splitting it open with his horsewhip. The northern gale snatched up the pungent powder and flung it into the wolves' faces. The creatures whimpered and shrank back. The barbarians hidden in the trees must have also realized they wouldn't succeed today with these two nuisances around. A long whistle sounded over the wind, and the wolf pack slunk off with their tails between their legs, leaving behind a mess of churned up snow, and a small, dark figure crumpled on the ground. Shun Yi's heart seized. Before he could get a better look, Gu Yuan urged his horse forward and shot past him with a whisper of wind. "How is he?" Shun Yi asked. "Breathing." Gu Yuan stuck out an expectant hand. "Your flask." Creeping closer, Shun Yi could see Gu Yuan held a boy, 11 or 12 years of age, and alarmingly thin. Bundled into Gu Yuan's arms, he was a tiny thing, covered head to toe in blood. One small arm dangled limply, seemingly broken. His other hand was still clenched around the hilt of a knife. Gu Yuan carefully took the hand with the blade. The boy startled back to consciousness, staring straight into the young general's eyes. His pitch-dark eyes sparkled like a pair of flint stones, unextinguished even on the verge of death. Gu Yuan flinched in surprise. "The flask," he repeated. Shun Yi tossed it over, and Gu Yuan caught it, pressing the lip to the boy's mouth. "Drink." Who knew if the boy understood or simply responded to his commanding tone? When Gu Yuan poured the liquor into his mouth, he didn't resist, obligingly swallowing a mouthful. Shun Yi quickly inspected him for injuries. "Not too bad. He has some claw marks on his back and a bite on one leg, but neither are severe. The rest might be from falling as he was running. Why is there so much blood?" "It's wolf blood," said Gu Yuan. "Huh?" Gu Yuan didn't elaborate, wrapping the boy in his cloak. Let's go. We'll stop over in Yanhui town. As he finished speaking, he heard a soft sound. The boy had finally released his death grip on the blood-soaked knife, allowing it to slip to the ground. He shifted in Guyuan's arms, then grabbed at his robes with a trembling hand. You trusted me so much, but you don't even know me. Mysteriously moved, Guyuan looked down at the strange child once again. He's so light, he thought. He unconsciously softened his grip, as if afraid to crush the fragile flesh and bones he had cradled in his arms. Many years later, as Uncle Wang sorted through old belongings in the Marquis estate, he dug out a pair of fur-lined bracers from the bottom of one trunk or another. The craftsmanship was rude, the sort of thing a village hunter might wear, not something that belonged in the Marquis estate. Afraid to throw anything away without confirmation, Uncle Wang caught Guyuan on his day off to ask him. Oh, these. A smile spread over Guyuan's face as soon as he saw the bracers. They were a gift from a wild child who fought wolves with his teeth. That kid sure did a number on that wolf. He hacked up a perfectly good pelt until it looked like it'd been gnawed by a dog. This was all the usable material. It was just enough for a pair of bracers. Hey! Chang, who had happened to pass by, recognized the maker of this pair of eyesores the moment he saw them. He reached out to snatch the bracers as Guyuan swept them nimbly out of reach. Must you hoard every bit of trash? Chang asked. Get rid of those things. I'll bag a whole pelt during the autumn hunt and make you a better pair. Perfect. Guyuan tucked the fur bracers into his lapels. That one will be a gift from a big beauty, but this one's a gift from a little beauty. Aw. Chang had no retort. As I remember it, that little beauty was quite the shy one. He stuttered awfully when he gave me this gift. Guyuan lifted the reigning emperor's chin with one shameless finger, affecting distaste. Not like this one, who keeps trying to stick his nose into other people's business. His skin must be thicker than the wolf's. Chang hissed and made a grab for his hand, but caught only air. He threw himself at Guyuan. Not as thick as yours. Hand those over. I clearly intended to give them to Shen Xianxiang back then. Give them to whom? Say that again? Uncle Wang retreated with a chuckle, not wanting to disrupt his master's fun. Your Majesty, you were clinging onto that little blade for dear life. Why did you drop it as soon as you opened your eyes and saw me? Perhaps because you were slightly more handsome than the wolves. Are you looking for a beating? A lot more handsome. A lot, okay? Or perhaps, my dear General, the connections between some people are written in the stars. After the first glance, the rest was inescapable. A note on the Yuanhe Emperor. The Yuanhe Emperor was a contradictory sort of person, especially in his latter years. He was narrow-minded, cowardly, and sentimental. Guyuan grew up at his side. As a child, he was both deaf and blind, and very pitiful. Emperor Wu's blood flowed in the little Marquis's veins, and he was the legitimate heir to the Black Iron Battalion. For reasons both logical and emotional, for the sake of both family and nation, the Yuanhe Emperor had to treat him well. Even if he lied to himself and everyone else as he did it, the people of the nation expected this much. At first, the Yuanhe Emperor only intended to go through the motions, but the pitiable old man wasn't born with a heart of steel. He had always been easy to sway. He spent the latter half of his life regretting what he'd done, and as time went on, his act became real. Although Guyuan and the old emperor were technically of the same generation, the Yuanhe Emperor raised him like a son, and a most favored son at that. Li Feng and Prince Wei added together didn't receive as much attention from their father as the solitary Guyuan. The old emperor's unspeakable wariness was a dark cloud hanging over Guyuan's head, while the old emperor's blatant favoritism laid the foundation for Guyuan's arrogance. Thus, Guyuan spent his adolescence trying to balance on these two thin wires. He wasn't afraid to show open defiance, to mouth the words of obedience while transgressing in secret, or to neglect imperial orders. He overstepped the bounds of etiquette as a subject on numerous occasions, got into trouble, and left it to the old emperor to smooth over, and even allowed the little princes to call him their imperial uncle, and, in one case, godfather, without proper authorization. As for the last, Shenyi was nearly scared to tears when Guyuan encouraged it. Never could he have imagined that in order to protect his fourth and youngest son, whose position within the line of succession was awkward, the Yuanhe emperor would not only fail to fault Guyuan for it, he would even make the title official. At the same time, Guyuan never truly crossed the line. He would carve himself open and smear his guts across the imperial city's 9 gates, but played deaf and mute in court. He stood entirely alone, and aside from those of the down-on-his-luck noble Shenyi, acknowledged no overtures from any other family, noble or notable, in the capital. Even knowing Li Feng differed from him in politics, he still acceded to the Yuanhe emperor's wishes and rushed back to the capital like a timely fall of rain to check Prince Wei when it came time for the long-gone emperor to ascend the throne. After Li Feng became the emperor, Guyuan set aside his old ways. For one thing, he shared little personal connection with Li Feng. The two were purely lord and subject. For another, he had matured in the intervening years, and understood that there were no mortal flesh beneath the black iron tiger tally or the imperial jade seal that served as the key to Great Liang. The highest ruler of the land and the marshal of the 3 divisions were both inhuman in the eyes of the nation. He found his own way and understood what kind of fate he was destined for. At that point, the man who had both feared and cherished him was gone. Beyond the palace walls, between the gas lamps, the painful love and hate Guyuan had attributed to this place were long extinguished. Truth or Dare, Steampunk Edition. In the year after Li Min ascended the throne, on the evening of the 16th of the 1st month, the hot spring courtyard in the northern imperial villa was lit bright as day. All the off-duty soldiers of the northern camp had come over. General Shun, in the capital for his annual report on his duties, had arranged to stay a few extra days, and even the ever hard-working emperor found an excuse to cancel court for the occasion. With His Majesty personally presiding over the gathering, the pesky sycophants hoping to use presenting birthday wishes as an excuse to suck up to the Marquis didn't dare show their faces. Everyone in the northern hot spring villas were their own people, and the atmosphere was merry and familiar. After the birthday feast concluded, the northern camp soldiers returned to the garrison, unable to leave their posts too long. The bustling courtyard gradually quieted. Hoping to liven things up again, Cao Chunhua suggested a game of flower passing. A bright little ball was to be passed around the circle while someone beat the drum. Whoever held it when the drumming stopped had to perform a task of the group's choosing. "Are we composing poems?" Guchun paled and waved his hands. "I'm not doing it. I can't. I could beat the drum for you all." "In that case, I'll have to be the flower," Guyuan replied. "Are you getting past your prime, sir?" Shenyi scoffed. "The imperial tutor personally taught you as a youth, and the sycophants all sing your praises as a learned general. Even your drunken scribbles are sold for thousands of taels." Guyuan slapped the table in rage. "What bastard sold them? And how come I never saw a single coin?" Seeing that Marshal Gu was about to hang up his general seal and refuse his salary to go home and scrawl a mountain of calligraphy, Master Feng Han hurried to smooth things over. "Composing poems over wine is an elegant pastime, but like the ritual songs of immortals, it may not be the most pleasant diversion. We needn't be so reserved. Instead of a poem, why not a song? Now that would be lively." Guyuan laughed. "Master Feng Han, now there's an idea. Hearing that Marshal Gu wanted to sing, everyone jolted in shock, heads aching as if they'd all taken a Parhelion arrow to the temple. Chang swiftly plucked up a piece of crispy fried meat and stuffed it into Guyuan's mouth. "Talk less and eat more. You haven't fully healed from your injuries. I told you to recover your strength. Have you forgotten your doctor's orders?" "That's right," Miss Chun chimed in with her solemn agreement. "Marshal, your lungs are injured. You mustn't strain them. Shen Yi did his part as well, adopting an obsequious tone. He said, It's really not necessary, sir. We all know you're capable. In the prime of your life, you must make sure to rest. Guchun shuddered. I may need a change of pants. With this musical murder weapon in attendance, they couldn't sing either. After a round of discussion, the half-drunk pillars of the nation, representing civil and military posts alike, settled on an unrefined game. They dug a hole large enough to squeeze a hand inside their bright little ball, and whoever held it when the drum stopped had to pull an embroidered pouch from inside. They could either answer the question written in the pouch or drink 3 cups of wine in punishment. Upon hearing the rules, Chang placed a hand over Guyuan's cup. He can't drink. Marshal Gu, who had just sat up attentively, flopped back into his seat. He drawled, Edict received, Your Majesty. In that case, I'll be spilling everything. The emperor thought it over, then summoned a palace attendant and whispered a few words. The attendant jogged off, then returned a moment later with a little jug and a porcelain plate. The top came off the jug, and everyone craned their necks forward only to be slapped in the face with a rich, sour fragrance. You can't drink wine, but you can have a few sips of vinegar. Chang'eng smiled. They're both made from grain, after all. Chang'eng was speechless. He and that twerp Shen Yi were made from flesh. Did that make them the same? He didn't like sweet things, but he hated sour ones. A single whiff of vinegar at the dinner table would send him into tantrums as a child. Later on, after the old Marquis had beaten him into submission, he stopped throwing tantrums, but could still barely force himself to swallow. When he saw the leafy vegetables piled on the porcelain plate and doused in vinegar, Guyuan's face drained of color. Where did you get Xiangchun in the middle of the winter? The palace had it in the ice house. It symbolizes eternal spring. How could I let you drink plain vinegar? Of course, I had to request some side dishes to accompany it. The emperor picked up some with a smile. Let me try it for you. I'll see if it's fresh. Guyuan leapt a meter out of range, no longer so eager to soak in his dear emperor's fragrance. In the first round, the bright ball stopped in Cao Chunhua's hands. He thumped his chest and took his time dramatically digging around inside before pulling out the embroidered pouch. But before he could read the slip of paper tucked inside, Guchun reached over and snatched it from his hands. Let me see. It says, What is the one thing you can't give up in this life? Oh, God. I think I know. Cao Chunhua turned to salute Chang'eng and declared, Loyalty! His Majesty smiled. Save it, you liar. Drink. Guchun Sorry. Guchun tried to pour a cup down his throat, but Cao Chunhua ducked and ran. No. Wait. I'll go again. Beauty! It's beauty! Dishonest, declared the emperor with all the force of imperial might. Punish him. The beautiful Cao Chunhua, flattened by this imperial edict, could do nothing but open his mouth and let Guchun pour 3 cups down his throat. Guyuan had been bedridden since his return from the battlefield in Liangjiang and had only recently been allowed to leave the house. Forget wine. He hadn't even tasted dregs. He was practically green with envy. But what good was envy? All he had was a jar of xiangchun drowned in vinegar, giving off a pungent scent that reminded him of dead insects. Perhaps his dread of the insects moved the heavens, for the little ball ended up in his hands in the second round. But Marshal Gu had never been one to go down without a fight. To avoid having vinegar-soaked xiangchun stuffed down his throat, the instant the palace attendant struck the final beat of the drum, he covertly flicked his fingers, hitting the attendant right on the elbow. The man's arm went numb and slumped forward, striking the drum one more time. Guyuan seized the opportunity to stuff the ball into Shen Yi's hands. Shen Yi was speechless. Why did he sit next to Gu Zushi? The embroidered pouch General Shen fished out was another quite fitting for the occasion. It read, Have you ever been beaten in punishment? What was the reason for your most recent beating? Shen Yi pointed at Guyuan. I have, because of him. Guyuan propped his chin on one hand, chuckling from the sidelines as if it was some sort of honor. Was it because you fed laxatives to your tutor? Chang asked. Shenyi stared at Gu Yuan in shock, trying to say with his eyes, "Huh, you go around spilling every little embarrassing incident to each other now? Aren't you ashamed?" "Oh, that was ages ago," Gu Yuan said. "Shen Jiping here has had guts the size of a pea since we were kids. If I didn't show him how to have fun, he'd have studied himself stupid long ago." Shen Yi scoffed. "Huh, thanks to your influence, I was lucky my dad didn't beat me stupid." Everyone urged him to tell the story. "It's been over a decade now," Shen Yi considered. "It was before the first rebellion in the western regions. I must have been 16 or 17. At 16, Chang and his companions had been traveling the nation with the Linyuan Pavilion. Everyone leaned forward at the revelation that the cool-headed and mature General Shan was still at home taking beatings for misbehavior at that age. The Yuanhe Emperor arranged an engagement between this guy and Grand Secretary Guo's daughter. Seizing his chance to strike back at Gu Yuan, Shen Yi said, "Now there was a girl as beautiful as a flower, radiant on the outside and pure on the inside. She lived up to her reputation as one of the twin beauties of the capital, the other being the crown prince's consort at the time, our empress dowager of today. Of course," Gu Yuan was quick to interrupt him. "Cut the nonsense, talking as if you actually met her. I never even met her." Under the cover of pouring more tea, Gu Yuan snuck a glance at the emperor. Chang was sitting beneath a lantern, its glow casting a gentle light over his features. Seeming to sense his gaze, Chang tapped Gu Yuan's thigh out of sight beneath the table, then took another piece of xiangquan from the plate in front of him with a fake smile. Gu Yuan shuddered. "I heard the stories. Miss Guo had no shortage of admirers, after all," Shen Yi said. "Some of them, when they heard about the engagement, thought it unfair. They all accused him of being a heartless playboy. Of course, the ones slandering him were playboys themselves, or they wouldn't have had time for such nonsense. The ringleader was Left Minister's son. This lad billed himself as the preeminent gentleman scholar of the capital, though where this so-called scholar had received his credentials, no one knew. What they did know was that he loved to flirt with women in his spare time. One day, this guy went to Fragrant Cloud Pavilion to see his love. Well, he had just taken his pants off when his private room in the pavilion caught fire. In his panic, the minister's son didn't even manage to find his belt. He darted outside, holding up his pants as smoke billowed at his back. Everyone started calling him Young Master Flying Cloud after that. The left minister was so ashamed he retired at the end of that year." Miss Chun was still puzzled. Turning to her fiancé, she asked, "Why did you get beaten?" Gu Yuan cackled. "Because this idiot refused to listen to me. I told him to walk right out the front door after setting the fire. He insisted on jumping out the window and going through the rear courtyard, where he ran right into old Master Shen, who was there meeting friends." Gu Yuan could hardly speak. He was laughing so hard. "He tried to be so sneaky." He even wore a disguise, but he couldn't fool his own dad. Fragrant Cloud Pavilion had been just behind Kite's Flight Pavilion. It was a high-class establishment where plenty of scholars liked to gather, and the food they served was exceptional. But no matter how highbrow it was still a pleasure house. His dad hadn't been doing anything illicit, but being caught by his own son meeting friends in an entertainment house was enough to make him fly into a rage and embarrassment, to say nothing of how his son had gotten up to an entirely fresh kind of mischief. A wicked plot like setting fire to someone's room was clearly Gu Yuan's idea, but old Master Shen couldn't beat the Marquis of Anding. He vented all his temper on his own son and beat Shen Yi until he howled. Afterward, Shen Yi was bedridden for over a month. Shen Yi hurled the colored ball at Gu Yuan in fury. "You take a penalty too." Gu Yuan was mystified. "Why?" "Because you planned that entire farce. Come to think of it, sir, you really have been strategizing from behind the scenes since you were a boy. I remember you had the layout of Fragrant Cloud Pavilion completely." "I'll do it. I'll do it. I owe you one, DP Xiong. Please close that cursed mouth of yours." Guyuan gamely picked up a piece of xiangquan beneath the emperor's watchful eyes and swallowed it like he was committing suicide by swallowing gold. As the third round began, Guyuan was still trying to choke down that piece of xiangquan. He held his breath and passed the ball to Shenyi before reaching for his cup of tea. But at the next beat of the drum, Shenyi, who should have passed the ball to Miss Chun, smashed it back into Guyuan's hands, lightning quick. Guyuan nearly dumped his tea down in front of his robes. He looked up in puzzlement. With a final dong, the drum fell silent. Shenyi burst out in laughter. Guyuan couldn't get into a slap fight with Shenyi at the table in front of all their friends, so he was left to magnanimously wave a hand. There's nothing I can't confess. What's there to be afraid of? I'll just... His boasting ground to a halt when he saw the slip of paper inside the embroidered pouch. It read, "At the lowest point in your life, what was your greatest comfort?" Upon seeing the marshal had lost his voice, everyone became terribly serious. Shenyi leaned over. "What does it say?" Guyuan tucked the paper strip away and slanted a look at Chang. His gaze went distant for a moment, thinking of who knows what, before he suddenly began to laugh. Perplexed, Chang blinked back at him. "What does it say?" The young emperor's gaze was crystal clear, as if all the lantern light in the northern villa was contained within his eyes. "It was you, silly," Guyuan thought. Whatever, might as well go for broke. Picking up his chopsticks, he ate every last one of those symbols of eternal spring on the plate in front of him, bite by bite. Oh, how lackluster a taste. And here was hoping his suffering would attract some good fortune. A secret tale from the northern border. In the last chapter, we reached the part of our story where General Shun got his revenge. He finally pulled one over on the marshal while he was overcome by vinegar fumes, forcing him to take that colorful little ball and read that particular slip of paper. Had it only asked about sources of comfort, well, Guyuan had many of those. A beauty named Chang'eng was the first. But aside from him, there was good food, good fun, and brothers in arms. The sullen-faced Shenyi, the tender flowers planted by Uncle Wang, the precious horses fed and brushed by Old Huo. There were many things in the world that made him pause in his steps in admiration or coaxed a smile from his lips. He had affection for all of them, and all were comforts to him. But when he considered himself to be at his lowest point in life, the first thing that popped into Guyuan's mind when he saw that line of script wasn't when he was newly orphaned, deaf, and blind. The moment was much too old, and his condition had persisted for decades afterward. He was used to it. Looking back on it now, it was the time before then, the years of his youth spent terrorizing the Marquis estate, that were blurry in his recollection. When he occasionally recalled some fragment, or when Uncle Wang and the others discussed old tales, he felt a distance from them, as though they were things that had happened to someone else. Nor did he think of the far western siege of the capital. By then, he had matured and become strong. He understood everything he should have understood, and had contemplated everything he should have contemplated. No one dared append little when they called him Marquis anymore. And when they spoke of the Black Iron Battalion, they first thought of Guyuan, and second of the late Marquis, Gu Shun. He was the final barrier between his people and the loss of home and country, and he had no pity to spare for himself. If pressed to choose, the time in his life that brought to mind such phrases as the lowest point or having nowhere to turn was when the long-gone emperor ascended the throne and ordered Guyuan to escort the northern barbarian heir Jiala Yinghuo out beyond the pass. Spring had come late that year. It was the 3rd month when he set out, but there wasn't a breath of life on the northern border, as if the heavens and earth had frozen solid, resigned never to see the sun again. Wolf packs buried the carcasses of sheep and cattle in deep pits in the snow, and after a walk through the bracing gale, a man could choke on the stink of iron from the cuts lashed into his mouth and nose by the stinging winds. Clad in light pelt armor, Shun Yi leapt down from his mount before his horse had fully come to a halt. He charged toward the commander's tent, the sound of muffled coughs reaching his ears even before he lifted the curtain. Shun Yi's hands shook with fright. The commander of the northern border garrison was standing guard before the commander's tent. "It's not the marshal," he hurried to say. "That's young Master Chun." "Dr. Chun?" "Yes, sir. They say he's in poor health. He usually never goes out in winter. He made an exception and rushed here this time, but ran into a snowstorm as soon as they left the pass. Traveling in weather like that wouldn't do even a healthy person any good, much less young Master Chun. The doctor came here to treat a patient only to end up one himself." The man sighed. Shun Yi had been riding through the snow all day and was still cloaked in its heavy chill. Afraid to make things worse by charging in, he drew his hand back from the tent flap. Traces of anxiety marred his usually handsome and composed visage, and his cheeks had sunken within the space of a few days. As if sensing its rider's unease, the horse stamped restlessly in place as Shun Yi handed his reins to another guard. "His Majesty instructed us to return to the west after we took the barbarian heir back to his homeland," Shun Yi confided, lowering his voice. "We should have set off ages ago. The governor's office on the road to the northwest garrison sent messengers asking us several times already. The 3 divisions of the Black Iron Battalion are waiting there. It would be understandable if we were late by a week or 2, but it's been nearly a month." "Is the marshal still—" The commander trailed off. Shun Yi shook his head, his face grave. "What happened?" The commander was perplexed. "The marshal practically grew up in the Northwest. Maybe he's less used to it after returning to the capital, but there's no reason he should find the winds beyond the northern pass so intolerable. Wasn't he perfectly fine when he arrived? You don't think it could be barbarian interference, do you?" "It's not." Shun Yi was unwilling to elaborate. A dark shadow slid across his face, and he waved the man off. "Let it be." A young man walked out from the tent, swaying as the northern gales knocked him off balance. After recovering his footing, he managed to get some words out. "General Shun, you've arrived. The young master invites you inside. He's ready to begin acupuncture." Shun Yi hemmed and hawed, then huffed out a sigh and went in. The second young master of the Taiyuan Prefecture Chun family was a miracle doctor with gifted hands, but was unable to cure himself. He was naturally frail and sickly, and had stayed sequestered in his home for years. Any time he left the house, he could expect to fall gravely ill. Rushing across the nation to the bitterly cold lands beyond the pass was as good as sacrificing his own life for his patients. Given how hard he was coughing, the decent thing would have been to insist he take a few days' rest. But despite rolling the words, "Young Master Chun, please take care of yourself," around on his tongue, in the end, Shun Yi said nothing. There was truly no one else. The braziers were blazing inside the commander's tent, but the warmth that hit Shun Yi's face seemed to carry the iron tang of blood. "Extinguish a few of those braziers," young Master Chun's voice carried from deeper in the tent. He had covered his face with a layer of gauze to prevent his coughing from disturbing the patient, and his voice came out muffled. "Aren't you afraid you'll bake 'em? Since when was your marshal so afraid of the cold?" His hands shook when he coughed, so he didn't apply the needles himself. He carefully instructed his apprentice from the side, much more nervous than if he'd been personally doing the work. He didn't dare lose focus for a second, and beads of sweat soon stood out on his forehead. Shun Yi was afraid to interrupt him. He hovered in the doorway across the room for nearly an hour before young Master Chun straightened in his seat. "It's done." Guyuan appeared semi-conscious as the doctor's apprentice helped him to a seated position. Shun Yi had started over when Guyuan batted the apprentice's hand away, then leaned over the edge of the bed and puked up a mouthful of blood. "Zishi!" Shun Yi yelped in fear. Unable to sit up without help, Guyuan slumped over. Young Master Chun's hand flew over the paper as he scribbled down a prescription. "Don't worry. I'll give him a pick-me-up." Shun Yi was silent. "Second young Master Chun, is that you?" Guyuan asked, hoarse. The doctor started in surprise. "You didn't give him the medicine for his eyes and ears the past few days, did you?" he asked Shun Yi. Shun Yi shook his head. He felt Guyuan's forehead. It was sheened in cold sweat, but the fever had broken. Young Master Chun considered, then sniffed the hem of his sleeve. He smiled. He's got a dog's nose. The world was a blur to Guyuan. He strained to recognize Shunyi before muttering weakly, "What did you summon him out here for? All this trouble. I'm not going to die." "Sir," Shunyi forced a bitter laugh, "we cooked this morning's porridge on your body. If your fever kept climbing, you might have become Great Liang's first human-shaped violet gold field." Guyuan couldn't hear well to begin with, and now his ears were ringing from the fever. He caught no more than a few words, not that he particularly cared what Shunyi had to say. His head dropped down as he closed his eyes. It was impossible to tell if he had fainted again or was merely resting. "General Shan, why is it that you look so mournful every time I see you?" Young Master Chun shook out the finished prescription and coughed again until his eyes flushed red at the corners. When he spoke again, however, there was a smile in his voice. This young man was always jovial. In his own words, those like him who were destined for an early death were unfortunate enough. If they couldn't at least look on the bright side, wouldn't that be heaping misery upon misery? When Shunyi heard his question, he thought to himself, "Well, that's just ridiculous. Most people look for a doctor because they're sick. Are they supposed to light a string of firecrackers to celebrate the occasion?" But he wasn't close with young Master Chun, so it wouldn't do to be too blunt. He bowed his head and said, "Chun-xiang, thank you for making the journey." "No trouble at all. Marshalgu once saved my younger sister's life, and I'm rather fond of him. Once he recovers, just have him send me a fan with some of his calligraphy on it. Then his illness, General Shan ought to know the cause." Young Master Chun smiled at him. "He's young and has a soldier's constitution. As long as he can keep some food down these next 3 days, he'll be all right. Don't worry." What, then, was the cause of Guyuan's illness? Before the turn of the year, he had hastened to the late Yuanhe Emperor's sickbed with the fourth prince in tow and managed to see the old emperor one last time. He had said to the dying man, "After your majesty passes, I will no longer have any family left in the world." Only now did he discover he had lost anything he could call a family long before then. Guyuan was a model patient. 3 military divisions were waiting on him, and he couldn't afford to be temperamental. He drank any medicine he was given and ate all his meals. After he woke, his personal guard, following the doctor's orders, made him a bowl of thoroughly overcooked meat porridge. Guyuan drained every drop without a word of complaint. When Shunyi heard, he sighed in relief. The word of a member of the Taiyuan Prefecture Chun family could indeed be relied upon. But in the middle of the night, the fever that had broken roared back with a fury, and Guyuan threw up everything he had eaten. When Shunyi charged into young Master Chun's tent in the middle of the night, he was surprised to find the white-clothed young man fully dressed, as if expecting his arrival. Young Master Chun looked placidly back at him. "I didn't say he would recover if he ate. I said he would recover if he managed to keep his food down. Let's go. I'll perform acupuncture on him again. We're treating the symptoms, but not the cause." Shunyi led the way to the commander's tent, blocking the wind for young Master Chun. He turned and asked quietly, "After 3 days." Young Master Chun paused in his step and sighed, a white plume of chilly air. "Then, General, you shall have to forgive my lack of knowledge and meager talents." Shunyi's heart sank. 3 days passed rapidly. Despite being a cooperative patient, Guyuan showed no improvement. He lost weight like his vitality was being bled away, and worst of all, nothing anyone said could get through to him. He was deaf and walled off from the world, unable to hear a word. On the 3rd evening, when his red-eyed personal guard brought his meal, Guyuan turned his head away and refused to eat. The guard was on the verge of tears. He stared at Shunyi, who had followed him into the tent, unsure what to do. Guyuan tilted his chin and smiled at the young guard, shaking his head. "Your soup noodles smell pretty good, but eating and throwing up all over and over is too much for my poor throat. I really can't swallow any more." "It's all right. You can head out first." Shunyi took the bowl, covered it, and placed it on a little furnace to keep warm, waving the guard out. He pulled a glass monocle from his lapels and set it on the bridge of Guyuan's nose. The icy metal of the frame shocked Guyuan a little further into wakefulness. He took a long moment to gather his strength and signed to Shenyi. "What is it?" Shenyi stood in place, a complicated look on his face, before screwing up his resolve and pulling out a letter. It's a reply from the capital. The two of them had lied up and down to Chang'e, then snuck out of the Marquis estate like thieves. Guyuan had nearly pulled out his hair fretting along the way, but never figured out how to placate him. In the end, he'd bullied Shenyi into ghostwriting a personal letter for him, which he made a copy of in his own hand and sent back home. Now, Chang'e had replied. This child of the Yuanhe emperor and a barbarian woman had vanished among civilians and grown up in Yanhui town. Now Guyuan knew the truth of the woman's flight. 30 barbarian suicide fighters had attacked the Black Iron Battalion, and Chang'e's mother had served as his father's scapegoat. Guyuan stared, stony-faced, at Shenyi through the glass monocle. "Get out." Shenyi pressed his lips into a tight line. He placed the canister with the letter at the head of Guyuan's bed and turned toward the doorway. After a few steps, he couldn't resist looking back again. "Zishi, you—" His answer was a crisp clatter. Guyuan had swept the mail canister to the ground. Worried he'd made the wrong move, Shenyi raced off to find Dr. Chan and ask him for other ideas. The command tent was left still and silent, without even the breath of a breeze. Guyuan sagged against the head of the bed. Illness had hollowed him out. He felt as if he had plunged into a steep ravine, and the first 20 years of his life were all on the other side. He had lived every one of those days, yet when he looked back, they seemed suddenly far beyond his reach. He couldn't resist glancing at the canister on the ground. As little as half a month ago, he had been eagerly awaiting this reply. He'd thought how his little Chang'e had so happily celebrated his birthday with him before Guyuan left without a goodbye, about how the kid always had so much on his mind and would surely be terribly hurt. Veins bulged on Guyuan's hand, so thin it was only a layer of skin over bone. "Shiliu, it's time to take your medicine." "Stop messing around. You'll burn yourself on the kanji." "Yifu, you're the person who treats me the best in this world." "I'm not going. I have to train. If I don't get some real skills, who will take care of you in the future?" "Yifu, eat your noodles, then come inside." Right. That bowl of noodles. It was overcooked and soggy and had bits of eggshell floating in the broth, about the same as the bowl Shenyi had just put over the fire. The furnace warmed the underside of the bowl, the savory scent of soup seeping through the gap between bowl and lid. It was just like the one that had greeted him the day of the 16th amid the desolate chill of the ice-bound capital. Guyuan's chest heaved. He struggled to his feet, but his knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground. Snatching a wind slasher stashed inside the bed curtains, he repurposed it as a walking stick to push himself upright and picked up the letter canister from where it had rolled away across the floor. He opened it slowly, with weak, shaking hands. "To my respected godfather, since our parting, I have had no family in all the capital. Pieces of armor serve as my sole companions, a meager comfort. I have nothing at all, only a pair of your cauldrons. The plum blossoms in the Marquis estate are at the end of their season. I hope you saw the flowers as you departed, or their efforts will have gone to waste. Another year spent on fruitless endeavors. Even if they bloom again next year, the blossoms won't be the same. There are many military affairs to see to in the Northwest. Is it unbecoming of me to disturb you so often with my letters? You must be very busy, and not missing me at all, but it's not the same for me. The capital city is too lonely. Aside from you, I have no one else to miss." Guyuan could barely hold onto the letter. The wind slasher fell to the floor, the crash of metal echoing beyond the walls of the tent. His personal guards rushed in at once in a terrible fright. That night, Guyuan endured the pain and swallowed half a bowl of soup noodles mixed with the taste of blood. He didn't throw up again. The man behind the capital's new fashions. In the 10th year of Longan, the new emperor personally appeared on the battlefield in Liangjiang before officially ascending the throne. Dongying switched sides at the very last moment, and Great Liang declared total victory in Jiangnan. The rest of the war was a foregone conclusion. Despite the far western pope's exceptional talent as a tactician, even he couldn't change the inevitable. Finally, Gu Yuan could hang up his marshal's seal. When Gu Yuan was still in the garrison at Liangjiang, he'd felt he was perfectly well. He hadn't broken any arms or legs, nor had he scarred his precious face. He was as handsome and elegant as ever. Perhaps he was encased in steel plates, but he had maintained a long friendship with these steel companions, and they were close as brothers. After defeating the far westerners, he fancied the only thing standing between him and riding triumphantly back onto the battlefield was a good night's sleep. After handing all his various responsibilities to Shanyi, Gu Yuan finally laid down his mental armor and let himself sleep like the dead in the commander's tent. After so many years spent sleeping with a weapon beneath his pillow, it was the best night of rest he'd had in ages. He slept so deeply he didn't even dream. He returned to wakefulness in a half-conscious haze, rousing to the faint sound of voices and the weight of a hand laid gently on his face. That person's fingers were cold, and their sleeves carried the familiar scent of pacifying fragrance. Chang. At the thought, the cord drawing up his consciousness slackened, and he sank again into slumber. It's been 3 days. Chang'eng looked up, his face pale. He was more exhausted now than he had been after winging his way to the battlefield in Liangjiang without sleep or rest, and his lips had begun to chap and crack. Why is he still not waking up? He asked Miss Chun, keeping his voice low. Chen Qingshu handed him a bowl of water. Chang'eng accepted it, but only took a single sip to check the temperature before carefully tipping it into Gu Yuan's mouth with a little spoon. The marshal's medicine contains sedatives, but it's not all the medication. He's pushed himself too hard these last years. The moment he let himself relax, it hit him all at once, Miss Chun said. There's also your pacifying fragrance, Your Majesty. Chang'eng was never without his pacifying fragrance. He practically marinated in the scent. Alarmed, he untied the sachet of powder and tossed it aside. You think it's a pacifying fragrance? That's right, I wanted to ask. He seems particularly sensitive to Miss Chun's formula and sleeps deeply if I light even a little, but it's a mild drug. It shouldn't have any adverse interactions, or is it because his health really is that poor? Your Majesty, Chen Qingshu said, sleeping deeply isn't a bad thing. I know, but actually, people like the Marquis, who have grown up soaked in medicine since youth, have a higher tolerance. I heard that during the assassination attempt at the hot spring villa in the northern outskirts, the perpetrators used enough sedatives to bring down several strong men, yet the Marquis merely experienced some momentary weakness in his limbs. Chen Qingshu explained patiently. Your Majesty, if he's unaffected by such a strong drug, what's a packet of pacifying fragrance? The reason he sleeps so deeply is more likely... More likely what? Chang'eng looked at her, perplexed. Chen Qingshu may have belonged to the Jianghu in many ways, but she was still a young and unmarried woman. It seemed improper to say more than this. She gave him an awkward smile and left after dropping a shallow curtsy. Chang'eng couldn't understand what had embarrassed her so. Mystified, he looked down and continued to spoon water into Gu Yuan's slack mouth. A thought crossed his mind, and his hand paused. If it wasn't the medicinal qualities that made Gu Yuan sleep so deeply, was it the scent? Because the one associated with the scent is... me? Chang'eng sat frozen for a while, then carefully set down the bowl of water. He felt there was a tiny pond within his heart, shuddering with an unending series of ripples. He took Gu Yuan's hand and gently rubbed at its calluses, then sighed and laced their fingers together. When Gu Yuan awoke again, it was to a great jostling, followed closely by a rumble like the sigh of an enormous beast. The muffled roar shocked even the half-deaf Gu Yuan from his sleep. His mind hadn't yet left the battlefield, and alarm slammed into him before he was fully awake. Gu Yuan's eyes flew open. He was immediately blinded by a bright white light. Instinctively tugging Chang'eng tighter into his arms, he reached for the wind slasher at the head of his bed. His hand met empty air. Where was his wind slasher? Where was his armor? Even without his glass monocle, Guyuan knew this wasn't his commander's tent in the Liangjiang garrison. The scent of cold iron and sweat from the soldiers coming in and out of the tent was gone, and there was an incense burner releasing a quiet, sedate fragrance at the head of the bed. The mattress beneath him was soft enough to melt his bones, and outside the window, a field of white. Since when did it snow in Jiangnan in the 3rd month? Or did he become even blinder than he'd thought? The man he was protecting in his arms pulled his face closer and pressed a kiss to the corner of his eye, then placed his glass monocle on the bridge of his nose. Guyuan's vision cleared. He heard a long whine, and the room shuddered one last time. White steam billowed outside the window like a sea of clouds, surging thickly before slowly scattering to reveal the scenery of the north, yet to come alive in the early spring. Rows of iron puppets and guards flanked the platform, led by the captain of the Imperial Guard. We've reached the capital, Zishi. We're home. Guyuan's last memory was of drifting off in the commander's tent in the Liangjiang garrison. He had merely closed and opened his eyes and found himself in the capital city. Face blank, he revealed the most confounded expression he'd ever worn in his life. Half a month later, the steam railway connecting the north and south officially commenced operation. The history books had it that the earliest steam locomotives burned violet gold and were strictly for military use. It wasn't until a few years after the war, when the Lingshu Institute renovated the steam engines and reduced fuel consumption, that civilian routes were developed. What the history books don't mention was that the first use to which Great Liang's new railway system was put was to spirit away the martial from the front lines. Alas, the history books so often miss the point. Later, although Chang'eng fully escaped the influence of the Wu'erge, he always kept a few packets of pacifying fragrance on him. Officials and civilians alike imitated the emperor in his health-conscious ways. Caring for one's health became the fashion of the era. And in their free time, the citizens would gather to discuss how to replenish qi and blood and soothe the mind. Meals containing medicinal ingredients became a distinct cuisine, which enjoyed a raging popularity in the capital for a time. On one occasion, when Miss Chun invited Chang'eng in the capital with General Shen, she smelled the faint herbal scent that still lingered on the emperor's person. After so many years, she had completely forgotten their offhand conversation on the steam train. She tactfully expressed that His Majesty's Wu'erge had indeed been fully cured, and he needn't continue to be so careful. Did he doubt her abilities? Chang'eng smiled and said nothing. Upon reaching middle age, Guyuan no longer went on long tours with the border garrisons. Aside from routine military inspections, he spent the great majority of his time in the capital city. After all, life in the capital was more comfortable, and he had someone to take care of him in his own estate. As time went on, he was so doted on at home that he developed a certain fussiness. Sometimes, when he went on long trips to new locations, he found himself struggling to sleep for a night or two. The strange thing was, so long as he placed a packet of pacifying fragrance beside his pillow, he had no difficulty sleeping at all. A few miscellaneous anecdotes. 1. Regarding Greenhaven. If anyone were to guess, they'd most certainly assume that Marshal Gu, who got his start as a soldier and spent years eating sand and sipping the northern wind, was the lackadaisical sort with no mind for fine details. The emperor, on the contrary, had been even-tempered and cultured since his youth. His every action bespoke an elegance sufficient to hide the foreign blood that ran in his veins. Perhaps it was natural to conclude that in private, the emperor would be the one planning every little thing, while Guyuan answered, "Whatever you want," to every inquiry. However, it was in fact Chang'eng, the village boy turned emperor, who wasn't nearly so bothered about the finer things in life as his elegant exterior suggested. Aside from burying himself in work, training his body, and caring for his health, He had few other hobbies. Whenever Guyun was away, he lived like a monk. He rose early and retired early, starting every morning sparring with the iron puppets. The guards would never dare chase the emperor around with their swords, before going off to attend court or handle other business. At mealtimes, he ate whatever the kitchen set before him. He was never picky if the food was bad, nor greedy if it was good. He ate until he was nearly, but not quite, full, and had no vile habit of indulging in drink after every meal. Because he'd slept poorly throughout his youth, he seldom drank tea, much less wine. He subsisted on plain boiled water, until Guyun returned, and along with him a life of sound and color. Guyun was his perfect opposite. He couldn't stand to be bored, and as soon as he was, one could expect a great fuss to be made. After many years of observation, Chang concluded that this wasn't because Guyun was truly so finicky, but simply because he enjoyed keeping himself busy. After selecting the villa that would become Greenhaven, the obvious next step was renovations. Chang had intended to handle the renovations himself. He figured it was difficult, boring work. Even if it was their own home, the thought and effort it would take to manage renovations for an estate of this size was immense. He didn't want Guyun to lose sleep over it, and so reluctantly took the burden on himself. By the time he managed to nail down the plans, Chang head had swelled 2 sizes with a burgeoning headache. When Guyun next returned to the capital from his inspections in the north, the Ministry of Works foreman in charge of the project met with him on the emperor's orders to ask if he had a drop or two of input. As it happened, the marshal's input was as dense as pouring rain. What Chang saw as difficult, boring work was Guyun's greatest source of entertainment over that period. During his time in the capital, Guyun turned up at the Ministry of Works every day to chatter with the 2 foremen in charge of the project, adding this and changing that. When he went home each day, he'd bring handfuls of random trinkets, which he offered to Chang like precious treasures. He showed him the most popular kind of decorative bricks in Jiangnan one day, or 5 different designs for a pavilion foyer the next, asking him every time to pick his favorite. Chang bent over and examined those 5 different plans with a magnifying glass 3 times over, yet failed to spot the differences between them. Well, that was all right. Chang didn't quite understand his enthusiasm, but as long as it made Guyun happy, he didn't mind. In the end, Guyun made almost all the decisions on the latter half of the renovations on Greenhaven. He had an endless patience for this kind of diversion. Even the variety of bamboo to be planted beside the pavilions was something he wanted to pick himself. Unable to decide, he bought a few specimens to grow in the Marquis estate in the capital, claiming he wanted to see the effect firsthand. Chang helped him plant the bamboo, thinking to himself that, standing in a row, all the little sprouts looked like they'd been born to the same mother. Perplexed, he wondered, maybe the differences will appear once they've grown a bit? Before Chang could see any differences, a few of the plants threw in the towel, unable to adjust to the cool climate of the capital. The question was consigned to eternal mystery. One day, long after Greenhaven was completed, Guyun pastured his horses in the rear mountains as Chang rolled up his pant legs to fish in the river. The moment Chang felt a tug on the line, Guyun's foolish horses would canter over and frisk about, as if they'd come just to make trouble. Chang sat for hours without catching a single fish. He was in no hurry. He sedately pulled in his line and put a new piece of bait on the hook. Sitting there with his eyes half-lidded, who knew if he was fishing or meditating? Guyun had a sudden thought. Say, didn't you say you'd build this estate? How did it end up becoming my job? My original ideas were simple, Chang said lazily. Just the buildings in the rear courtyard. Out of the entirety of Greenhaven, the rooms in which the 2 of them lived were the only part where Guyun hadn't made major revisions. When he joined the planning, Chang had made detailed arrangements for them already. A slightly sunken courtyard with winding brooks, duckweed, and stone steps, all illustrated in His Majesty's own hand. Guyun lay down beside the lake, pillowing his head on his hands. The foreman said you gave them free rein everywhere else. I think the truth is you only had the patience to renovate one courtyard. Chang smiled. It's not that I had the patience for only one courtyard. It's because my heart contains only one courtyard. Guyuan blinked. Great Master Liao Zhen had once said, if your heart contains only a corner, worries the size of a house must be squeezed into a corner. If your heart is as large as the world, worries the size of a mountain will be no more than a drop in the ocean. Although the great master was not fond of hygiene, he was one of the most eminent monks of his generation. In Changgung's youth, he had heeded this advice and banished his worries and resentments to the furthest reaches of the land. But now all his troubles had resolved themselves, and so, much like the Buddhist parable of Mount Meru, he stored his world and its four corners back into a speck the size of a mustard seed, stuffing it all inside one little courtyard. Squished up like that, would his affections not also be condensed beyond measure? A school of fish was about to make another half-hearted approach when the sound of hoofbeats came up again behind him. Changgung sighed. Marshal, if those retired soldiers of yours don't control themselves, we'll have no grilled fish for dinner tonight. You might as well boil your hand because that's all you'll be eating. Guyuan peeled off his outer robe. Wait for it. Changgung thought the marshal was going to go discipline his wayward horses. Instead, he nearly got a face full of water as Guyuan jumped into the river. Catch, he said. One hand sliced into the water, not raising a single splash, and he scooped up a plump fish and tossed it into the air. It sparkled in the sunlight, glittering as it crashed right into Changgung's arms. The droplets of water arcing behind its tail traced a shimmering rainbow in the air. The former emperor fumbled to catch it, dropping his fishing pole into the river. Gusushi, how old are you? Guyuan laughed uproariously, but his delight soon turned to sorrow. That evening, he didn't taste the grilled fish of his dreams. Afraid he'd catch cold after his dip in the river, Changgung marched him off to a hot bath, poured warm tea down his throat, and overrode all his objections, turning the promise of grilled fish into a tragically bland fish soup. He even added chopped ginger. This damned madman of an emperor! 2. Regarding why Changgung continued to be chased around by iron puppets after becoming emperor. Unlike Guyuan, who had been raised on the battlefield, Changgung never had many opportunities to wield a weapon in battle. After his ascension, countries from all 7 seas bowed to Great Liang's might, and the nation was at peace. Soldiers were sent to work the fields in the border towns, and the Northwest Garrison organized a melon-growing competition to see which general's foot soldiers could grow the biggest, sweetest melons. Hu Zhonghui won first place and earned himself the moniker of Great General of the Godly Melons. He was inordinately pleased with himself and foisted a cart full of his wares on Guyuan every time he returned to the capital to report on his duties, whether the marshal wanted him or not. In this peaceful clime, the emperor obviously would never personally don his armor and take to the battlefield. But still he rose before dawn each day to give the Marquis Estate's iron puppets their round of bare-handed beatings. He could work up a sweat even on the coldest days of winter, and paused for neither wind nor rain. Even many years later, when his hair was streaked with white, he could still operate a suit of hawk armor and draw the heaviest of iron bows. Later generations surmised he retained these habits due to his experiences early in life. Changgung, Li Min, posthumously known as Emperor Wen of Liang, had grown up in dirt-poor Yanhui town. Even if Guyuan had taken him back to the capital in his teens, he had lived there for only a little over a year, not enough time to grow accustomed to the capital's luxuries before he went off to roam the world with Great Master Liao Zhen. From his earliest years, he relied on his wits to minimize his suffering at Xu Liang's hands. As a child, he held tight to his knife and fended off a wolf pack's attack until help arrived. As a youth, he left home and encountered countless local ruffians, mountain bandits, and Jianghu wanderers with every sort of strange or wicked temperament. There were many instances when a fight might have broken out with the slightest slip of the tongue, and his companions couldn't be relied upon for protection. Whether he chose to fight or run, he depended wholly on himself. And when he finally reached adulthood and returned to the capital to accept his princely title, the far westerners nearly ground the city to dust. The first half of his life was spent in the swirling turmoil of war, unrest, and revolution. He never learned to be an aloof noble who left the matter of his personal safety to the personal and imperial guards. He was like a lone wolf, diligently sharpening his claws and teeth, even while living a life of comfort. He'd always felt that one chip more in his hands was better than one chip less, and he reminded himself that power was as fleeting as the clouds scudding across the sky. One ought never grow infatuated with or reliant upon it. In the end, it was only through expending every last gram of his strength and with the help of a great dash of luck that he had managed to walk the tightrope over the most treacherous ravine and protect all he had wanted to. After all he'd been through, how could this man ever lower his guard? Stars of Chaos. Fiend. Author Afterword. This story is a fairy tale written for kidults. It often seems that, in life, loneliness is more inevitable than death. To young readers, perhaps death is far off, something to be considered only in the distant future. If one can find meaning in life and death during one's time on this earth, then perhaps the prospect of leaving it might even become, to some, something romantic. The same cannot be said of loneliness. Loneliness grows in the cracks of our bones and lingers in the spaces between our breaths. The extroverted reach out to their peers in every way they can, hoping to establish a flash of connection and forget their solitude. Meanwhile, the introverted turn to their own souls for comfort in a futile attempt to bury their loneliness beneath a veneer of calm. During Stars of Chaos, Chapolong's initial serialization on JJWXC, many readers, yet to finish the novel, left their pessimistic predictions under each chapter. Some believed the protagonists' intense feelings for each other would be tainted by power, while others presumed the chaos of war would force them to part forever in life and death. Everyone knows the world is as changeable as the tide. Human emotions are as thin as paper, and regardless of whether one is a saint, sage, deity, or demon, everyone is bound by their own circumstances. But I did not allow this story to develop that way. Instead, I did my best to turn this novel into a dreamy reverie, a puff of cotton candy that might be sold by Disney. To that end, I constructed an intricate plot with many details to give the semblance of realism. This way, in the handful of hours during which readers immerse themselves in this story, they could forget the trials and tribulations of life and find some small measure of solace. This is the kind of author I am. I do not wish to touch the truths of the world, nor do I wish to interrogate anyone's soul. I only wish to comfort you, my readers. Good night. Priest. Written on the night of January 14th, 2024, in Beijing, China. Well, we have reached the end. The official end of the entire Danmei series, Stars of Chaos, also known as Shapolang by Priest. And it's 12:28 a.m. and I just finished this. I'm satisfied. I think overall I really enjoyed this series. Not quite sure how I feel about literally the very last part of the last chapter, just like the way that it ended. I'm not mad at it, but that's fine. Like I said, before the extras even came, I was completely satisfied with the way the last official chapter ended. But nevertheless, we've got a couple of things to talk about. I'm not going to say much because, like I said, it's 12:29 now in the morning. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that after reading these chapters, I've always loved Guyuan's character. But I realize sometimes that Guyuan is quite a headache and a half. Yes, that is a fact. And you'll see under in the dictionary, the definition of headache is guyuan. The second thing I want to say is concerning Cao Chunhua and the one thing he cannot give up in life. I am going to say that he cannot give up his crush on Guyun. That just has to be what it is. I don't know what else it could be, but I'm thinking it's that. And I think Chang'eng knows that as well, which is why he called him a liar. And even with him being in a relationship with Guyuan, he even still to that day, that one time when he sent Cao Chunhua off, he knew that his friend or follower or whatever still had a little crush on Guyuan. So that's what I'm thinking it is. But that's neither here nor there. That's my little speculator dorado. Speculation. Sorry. Sometimes I make up words or embellish them. I thought it was sad when it was first mentioned books ago about how Guyuan was basically like to the emperor, once you die, I won't have any family left. As he recalled that, or as they went through that memory, it made me sadder this time around. And it just broke my heart, especially after he read Chang'eng's letter. Gosh, my heart just broke into pieces. And I remember being upset at Guyuan about that, how he just left like that and didn't say goodbye to Chang'eng. But last thing that I want to say is that I found it so beautiful, and I'm glad that Miss Chun is the one who brought it to his attention without necessarily saying it, but Chang'eng felt the rest of the way through. I love that the pacifying fragrance is soothing to Guyuan. And that's just really a testament to his deep love and trust of Chang'eng. The fact that for all this time, really, because it's been happening for a while, that he loves and trusts Chang'eng so much that even just in his presence and smelling the pacifying fragrance, he could just easily fall asleep. Whether it was restful sleep or just regular sleep, not necessarily important, but the fact that he just so easily did it, I just thought that was beautiful to know that Chang'eng soothes his spirit. That is all I have to say. I would love for you guys to leave your comments below. I thought about doing a short video like I did for 1,000 Autumns at the end of my reading about my favorite aspects concerning Stars of Chaos. I don't know if I'm going to do that. I don't know. You guys can tell me what you think, and we'll go from there. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. I guess I was more acquainted with 1,000 Autumns because I had read it before, and then I read it again for you guys. But even with me reading it again, I would also go back and listen to my recordings. So it was like I was reading it 2 times in one time. So 3 times total, Anyway, like I said, please leave your comments below. Thank you all so much who have stuck with me from the beginning of this series all the way to the end of the series. Shoot, thank you even to those who have joined me for 1,000 Autumns and those who joined me for the Disabled Tyrant's Beloved Pet Fish. I hope you all enjoyed Stars of Chaos. I know I did. As far as my favorite Danmei series, I don't know where I put this one yet. I'll have to think hard on it, but I do know that overall I thoroughly enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm satisfied with Priest. This gives me hope for when I consider reading Guardian in the future. So I don't want to ramble. Yeah, I won't say anything else. You guys have an excellent evening, and I hope you continue to enjoy the Disabled Tyrant's Beloved Pet Fish, as that is now our sole focus. Well, I Neiman.